No, I think she's wearing a skin face mask.
Oh, that's
Objects in Game of Thrones of interest that have gravity. The Catspaw Dagger is kind of a big one.
And regardless, she did then go and have sex with Sir
Yeah.
So, like, you know, good for her.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to We Need to Talk About, a weekly video series where Digital Spy talks about the biggest shows in the world. And this time around, that's House of the Dragon, episode 4. I am your host this week, David Opie, and I am joined by Janet Lee.
Hello.
Gabriella Geisinger.
Hello.
And Ali Griffiths.
Hello.
Obviously, episode 4, there's one big talking point, and this kind of talking point is going to thread into everything we talk about, which is Rhaenyra and Daemon, and what the hell they were getting up to this week. So, before we get on to the nitty gritty, the unmentionables, as it were, let's talk about how we got to this point with their relationship. I know Janet and Gabriella, you were going to start by jumping in a bit and talking about how this sets up everything else, really.
I feel like we need to rename this series Let's Talk About Sex, because it was pretty much the main focal point of this whole episode. But I really like the way House of Dragons is using sex in a really purposeful way. So it's not just salacious and all about being evocative. They're really using it to help tell the story. And I think we saw a lot about Rhaenyra's and Daemon's relationship through that teeny tiny little brief 10-second sex exploits that they went through. Very incestuous. Doesn't sit well, but we managed through it. But I know there's a lot of talk about the fact that Daemon is just using his sexual relationship with Rhaenyra to kind of further his own position within the realm. And that's pretty much part of his whole idea. He goes to Viserys and he's like, you know what, I'll have her. She's damaged goods, but I'll take her anyway. But I think deep down, there is some kind of romantic connection between those two anyway. It's not just about him trying to further his own ambitions. It's
cute.
Cute. A little bit sickening. It's not just about him trying to further his own ambitions. He genuinely has some feelings towards her, and I think there are little snippets that we've seen along the way that kind of imply that. There's that scene earlier, I think it's in episode 1, where he hands Rhaenyra the necklace, and she seems to carry that with her like really dearly, because when he comes back from being exiled, she's still wearing that necklace. But also little things beyond that, like the way they interact with each other, the fact that she's the one who goes to him in the throne room when he's sitting on the throne, Viserys' throne, and she's the only one that can have that kind of relationship and that talk with him when he steals Balon's egg and scarpers off to Dragonstone. I think there's always been a connection between them that's more intimate than just about the lusty side of House of Dragons.
This episode, obviously, the big Daemon and Rhaenyra thing is like, he leaves her the letter, they go out on the like night on the town together. He's showing her this like other side of King's Landing. This is the freedom that like
the underbelly
can have, or he could have. So do you think that to what extent is that like a calculated move on his part because I hadn't thought about it that way, but like to get to the point where he's like leaning in, she's enamored with him, and then he can like marry her off? Or do you think that he genuinely sees her as like kin and wants to kind of like?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think he's always at the back of his mind got something calculated going on, and they could have had that really intimate scene anywhere. Like they have a whole castle. I'm sure there's a little scullery room that you can just go off into and do your thing. But he takes her to this brothel and he does it. So that's very calculated. But also that sex scene between them, I guess it could have been longer. I guess he could have handled it better, but he almost rejects her in a way. And I think that rejection is more to do with the fact that he actually feels guilty, a little bit of guilt. There's a little bit of something going on for him in that moment that he feels like, I'm misleading her, I'm betraying her. And so he can't continue on. And we know that he has problems when he's got a lot of emotional things going on, like he struggles to perform, like in the first episode. And so I think that there is something in that, the fact that he cares about Rhaenyra, the fact that he genuinely wants the best for her, but also he's selfish and he wants the best for himself. So
I think The thing that I took away from it was less that of that and more that he was probably caught off guard by his own desires. And like you're saying, he doesn't really know how to process his emotions and stress and things like that. And so while the whole kind of romp through Silk Road and all that, I think that was all very calculated. I think it was calculated up until the point where he realized that he wasn't in control anymore. Because
that's
the thing,
interesting.
right? And so I think that moment where it switches and she is like pursuing him, because that's when he pulls back, is when she's leaning into it. And then he's like, okay, wait, I'm out of my depth here a little bit, and needs to pedal back from that moment.
Maybe he thought he was more in control than he actually was.
Right, exactly. And I think that's like an interesting dynamic that bonds the two of them in a way, because they're only in so much control of their lives, which is another thing that the show talks about a lot with her, is, you know, she wants to be queen, but she also doesn't want all of the restrictions that come with that responsibility. And so it's that dilemma of how much control do you really have over your own life?
Well, speaking of shipping, a couple I have been shipping previously was Rhaenyra and Alicent. You know, back when there was those erotic tones earlier on in episode 1 in particular. You know, teenagers, close friends, maybe a bit more, possibly, likely, maybe. So yeah, and then this episode brings in kind of queer themes again in the brothel kind of. It's like King's Landing's version of Berghain's dark room.
Yeah, extremely big Berlin vibes in that dark room.
Yeah, recommend. Yeah, so it's really interesting because there's aspects of queerness going on in the background, which hasn't really been brought to the fore in other ways at this point. But again, it's still kind of nameless characters, right? It's just background people, but it's still very much a part of this scene. And I wonder if it's, as someone who didn't watch Game of Thrones, is it being portrayed in a way where it's the queerness is part of this seedy underground brothel thing, or is it more that everyone's a bit more accepting in general, and it's just kind of general queer vibes, everyone living their best lives? I don't know. What did you think, Ali?
I think it's interesting. Like, I think obviously when they walk into the White Worm is the name of the establishment. They walk in, they go like downstairs. It is a dark. They go into like that dark room where like there's lots of people having sex all around them, and there are like two men like very clearly having a good time, and the camera lingers on it for a second. Rhaenyra looks back at them again. The camera comes back to them again. Like, it feels like a very deliberate editing choice to be like, look, here are two men having sex in this show. Which I thought was interesting, and it's like, it definitely feels like a conscious choice the show's making.
I'm not complaining.
But like you said, like they are background characters, but there are queer themes like running through the show. And Janet, I know in your interview with Emma Darcy and Olivia Cook, who we are yet to kind of see in those roles, Emma Darcy says about like there being a kind of charged eroticism in early friendships when you are kind of like playing out relationship roles. So I think there's queer themes throughout the show already, which is good. But yeah, this is very much background. And then in contrast with Game of Thrones, like there aren't kind of, I wouldn't say there are like huge kind of massive LGBTQ characters in the show, but there are like noteworthy ones, right? Like we do have
Renly
and Loras Tyrell, and obviously Oberyn Martell, like Pedro Pascal plays like, you know, kind of an openly bisexual character. So like they've always been there in Game of Thrones, and I think they're there in the books as well. It just draws out onto what extent.
I think
the show.
Again, it all plays back into that theme of power, right? So sex in marriage is a political power tool, and queer, lesbian and gay couples don't procreate, right? They don't have biological children. So what's the point politically? What's the point of those relationships? So the only place where they're going to be more
open and free,
but like just like to exist in a way that's like not an issue, nor is it's like neither good nor bad, it just is. It makes sense for that to take place outside the palace, because within the confines of the royal sort of you know structure, it's all about the line, it's all about the blood and the lineage. So you know what good and being a couple do, it wouldn't do them any good. So
I will say, without spoiling too much, there will be some more LGBTQ relationship coming. That's very interesting to see.
I mean,
yeah,
this kind of highlights the issue, right? Sometimes with TV shows, you know, a movie, you've got the whole story, you know everything, and you can really analyze it as a whole piece. Whereas shows, we are playing week by week, of course. So something we might feel early on can be very either contradicted or really supported and enhanced later on. So very excited.
I think the other thing I would say, just like on ideas of queerness in general in this show, like I think so much of what the show is concerned with is gender. And like you can't separate that from queer identities in that way. And I think like there is a lot of queerness happening with Rhaenyra's storyline. Like there is a scene in this episode where she is dressed in boy clothes. She leaves the house. There is a really key moment for me. She walks past the guy and he's like, "Excuse me, boy," and she turns to Daemon and she's grinning and she's like, "He called me boy," which I took to be a really powerful like moment for her character. And I think if you were a different kind of critic, you could make a very interesting case for like a trans read of Rhaenyra in this moment, and like freedom and joy and obviously it's to do with gender roles and what men are allowed to do and what women are allowed to do. But the ease with which Rhaenyra steps into kind of male gender role, I think, is really interesting. And obviously, I think the show is interested in that. More generally, we know that like when Emma Darcy, a non-binary actor, steps into that role, I imagine they will bring a different type of experience and different type of performance to that character. I imagine that casting choice was deliberate and interesting. And so I think there's, beyond just sex and relationships, there's also ideas around identity and queerness kind of being played with as well.
Well, you mentioned performance, and you know we mentioned sex is a very much performance and aspects of this show. So I think it's a good time to move on, perhaps to Rhaenyra and Daemon, but also Alicent and Viserys have a sex scene which is a lot less fun, a lot less Berlin free, living your best life vibes. It's much more harrowing and politically driven and just quite uncomfortable to watch. So what are we feeling about that and the way the show very deliberately contrasts these two scenes?
It was like a blunt tool to make a fine point, I think.
But it needed to be blunt in order to, you to feel it.
Yes, but I also felt like it reminded me of when they were talking about the C-section. When the showrunners talked about the C-section afterward, and they were like, "Don't worry, we're gonna like, juxtapose it with other experiences of like women and childbirth and all that kind of stuff." And I thought, okay, like that's fine, but it does feel a bit like justifying stuff post decision to have done it in the first place. And like I have no problem with like all sorts of sex happening on screen. Like that's fine. That's not the issue. The issue is more like it's a very much a binary, right? It's either Rhaenyra or it's Alicent. It's either,
there's no in between.
Yeah, it's more.
But I think that's the point it's trying to make, that for women there are very few choices, and you can have the kind of freedom that Rhaenyra has, but that comes with consequences, which we later see. Or your other choices, you get shoved into a political marriage like Alicent, and you're forced to.
It just felt a bit on the nose for me. I think I was kind of like between the imagery and the dialogue, basically saying exactly what you said because earlier when they're sitting on the bench and they have that conversation where Rhaenyra is like, "Oh, I don't want to be like locked in a castle, forced to pump out babies," and looks at Alicent and is like, "Sorry," and then
it's so rough. It's so rough.
It just feels a bit like sometimes I'm in favor of kind of blunt, like just say it the way it is because it's the way it is. But on the other hand, I was kind of like, for a show that is so over the top with those themes and imagery, I was kind of like, it would be nice to get a more nuanced, subtle exploration of the thing with her in the street and the dynamics of gender. That's a much more, even though she just like, "You call me a boy," like that also isn't, even though it's a blunt statement, the moment is, there's more nuance to that moment and the roles of gender. Whereas this felt very much like, and now we're making a point, everyone. Hey,
I guess
pound that message home, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
Or I guess the context there.
There it is.
The context there, I guess, is like the scenes we're talking about, right? Are the stuff with the scenes with Daemon happen, and then Rhaenyra runs home, and we have like her and Kristen Cole. But kind of starts before that, right? We have her and Daemon and her kind of like night of freedom, outside of the castle, and then those scenes are edited and cut against kind of Alicent's night in, basically Alicent's night at home, where Aegon is crying.
Alicent's night in.
It's like a sitcom title. I love it.
Aegon is crying. She has to like wash Viserys in the bath. She is having a very like kind of
different
lonely
experience.
Yeah, a very lonely domestic time whilst Rhaenyra has this freedom. And then the end of that juxtaposition is, Rhaenyra and Kristen Cole's very kind of like tender, kind of sexy sex scene versus like Alicent getting basically a "you up" text at 2 a.m. from Viserys, where he's like, "Can you come over?" Like that's and it isn't subtle, but I think it's interesting when you see it played out, because again, it's this idea of like Rhaenyra is bound by some of the same rules as Alicent, but she also has some freedoms that no one else in the realm really does. Like she can go to a man who's guarding her door and say, like, there's a power dynamic there, right?
But
like,
that's another thing that we're not talking about, right? Is that power dynamic of her being like, boy.
But I mean, hey, he had that choice there too. He could have walked away, but clearly, I mean,
he's his boss, basically. She was like, oi. Come here. She named him, right? She named him as a knight, changed his life, and then is like, I'm horny, didn't get it off with my uncle, come here, finish the job.
It's tricky. It's tricky. On the one hand, you're like, oh, they're really hot, and also it seems consensual. So this is all great. And also, there's also that comparison between Rhaenyra and Daemon. So you're like, there's also a sigh of relief. You're like, oh, I don't have to feel weird about this.
Yeah.
This is just fun. They're living their best lives. But yeah, again, obviously, like you say, there is this power dynamic, which is
and
you can so awkward.
But I think they've been playing at their relationship for a while now. That there's been that kind of bubbling, like emotional connection between them, and there's been that interest. So I think she goes to him knowing that there's something between them, whether or not he can really truly feel like he can use his authority to refuse.
I think, speaking of the fact that it is hot though, I think I think it's worth pointing out, like, obviously the show is doing this in terms of like the subtext and the narrative points at this moment, but also like the way these two scenes are filmed is supposed to communicate something very clear to us, right? Like the Rhaenyra and Kristen Cole sex scene, I was like thinking about whilst we were watching it, the way that it compares to other Game of Thrones sex scenes, and like it's very much the camera is on Rhaenyra, it's very much on her face, it's very much on like her pleasure, basically, is what's being focused on. The way in which actually she is in control of this situation, there is a level of enthusiastic consent happening on her part, if not perhaps on Kristen's in the same way, but it's very much shot to tell us that like it's like her sex scene, if that makes sense, in a way that like often in this show the camera is on like the man, it's on his face, it's on his kind of enjoyment, but it's interesting because as much as we can derive pleasure from the way that the Rhaenyra's face is shot in that scene, the Alicent and Viserys sex scene is also shot with a focus on her face, but it's shot from above. It's shot from like this distance, right? Like it implies, I think, a level of kind of detachment, disassociation happening on Alicent's part. Like the Rhaenyra sex scene is like the camera is in the mix. It's like showing us all these different angles. It's showing us this like sensuality, but for Alicent, she is kind of like having an out-of-body experience. The camera is high, like you see her blank face. It's I just think the way they're shot is interesting and worth kind of like, it tells you a lot about what we're supposed to kind of glean from their mental states.
Okay, so we talked a lot about sex, as House of the Dragon kind of encourages us to do.
This is the sex episode, honestly.
Yeah. Can't complain about good old sex.
You can't even say it.
Sexapode. And we're going to have many more, I'm sure, week in, week out. So, but let's take a little breather. Let's calm down. Let's have a quick cold shower. Talk about something a little bit more about the lore, because the Catspaw Dagger plays a role here, which Game of Thrones fans might recall from a few years back. So, Ali, do you want to talk a little bit about why that's
sure.
an important role this time?
I think I might need Janet to have to tag in Janet because she is our Game of Thrones lore master at certain points. But yeah, I think beyond like general kind of analysis of what this episode is doing, there are also some like key Easter eggs for Game of Thrones fans. Yeah. One of which was the kind of like the return of the what we colloquially call like the Catspaw Dagger, which is the blade that Viserys talks to Rhaenyra about. It's the one that's like in the fire and the mold. in near the end of the episode, and it's the one that has the inscription of the prophecy on it that he kind of talks Rhaenyra through, talks about the Song of Ice and Fire, which all of our ears were like, ooh. It's noteworthy for Game of Thrones fans because it has been a part of the show since kind of basically the very, very beginning. Like plays a key part in the first season. It is the weapon that is used in the attempted assassination of Bran when he's in a coma after falling out of the tower. It passes around from Littlefinger, who says that it's his, but it was that Tyrion took it. Catelyn Stark has it for a while because she's going to use it as evidence that the Lannisters were guilty. She gives it to Ned. He gives it back to Littlefinger. And then
Littlefinger stole that. What did he give it to him, or did he steal it? One of the two. Yeah,
and then basically what happens is Littlefinger, as kind of like in a bit of a twisted way, gives it to Bran, I think, and then Bran eventually the Catspaw Dagger ends up in the hands of Arya, and she uses it to do what she does best, which is a great moment. Of all of the things and objects in Game of Thrones of interest that have gravity, the Catspaw Dagger is kind of a big one. So it's this massive Easter egg, and I think the fact that us being shown it right now should mean something to you as a viewer. Basically, it's a moment to take notice. Like, it is a symbol in the world of Game of Thrones that means something and will go on to mean something, right? It has the prophecy about. You can take this bit away, Janet. Talk to me about the prophecy on the blade.
The prophecy is the prince that was promised. And so that's basically the whole story that Viserys tells Rhaenyra about her duty and how Aegon had a dream about the prince who was promised and that he would one day help to unify the realm and defeat the Night King. So I think it's really nice to see that Catspaw Dagger come back up, and I think it's really nice to see the inscription written on the blade in the fire. I do feel like it now makes me think that Game of Thrones made a mistake in getting Arya to be the one to kill the Night King, if it is in fact the dagger that was meant to prophesize the prince who was promised, because then it feels like it should be the prince who was promised who, deals the fatal blow.
Which we think is Jon Snow, right? That's the general consensus.
Yes, I do personally think it's Jon Snow, but there is an argument for saying that the prince who was promised, because it's genderless, it could have been the unity of Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, and that they two together come in as one, as the prince who was promised, because they both in some ways help unify the realm.
Episode, there's also another little hint of a prophecy. It's a more subtle one, but there's a moment when Rhaenyra is, before she reaches the brothel, before the sexapode takes over, she encounters this old lady who's got, I don't know, I didn't see it properly. It was dark. Her eyes are gone.
No, I think she's wearing a skin face mask.
Oh, that's cute.
A mask made of skin.
So,
lovely.
Fashion.
Drop the skincare routine.
But she's too busy to drop that skincare routine, because she's like, "Oi, Rhaenyra, do you wish to know your deaf child?" And then it's like, ooh. If you're a fan of the source material, in particular A Dance with Dragons, you will already know what happens to Rhaenyra. Her fate has actually already been sealed within the source material. And also, interestingly enough, even if you haven't read the books, Game of Thrones also spoiled this. It was kind of a throwaway scene from back in season 3, so it's almost 9 years ago now. It was 2013. But there's a moment where King Joffrey is casually strolling along, and he points out, oh, this is where Rhaenyra died. It was pretty grim. It was pretty brutal. She got eaten by a dragon at the behest of her brother, Aegon, half-brother, who we've already met now in House of the Dragon. But Aegon here is a cute little toddler, Alice, in Alicent's lap. But he's going to grow up, and he is going to murder the hell out of Rhaenyra, we think. But.
Look at Gabriella's face.
I swear, I don't remember anything about the show. I didn't watch it. I forgot.
It was like a very short scene 9 years ago. We forgive you for that.
A lot has happened in 9 years.
A lot of shows. A lot of shows and a lot of weird prophecies. But it's interesting because so far the show has made some subtle changes to the books, but it's been more like little dynamics and relationships. There's not been any major events, but it will be interesting to see if are we taking all this time to inevitably reach a point we all know, or is House of the Dragon going to pull the rug out from us under a little bit and twist and shake things up?
I think it's interesting I think Gabriella's reaction there was really interesting. Like, to what extent can this show, which is a prequel and to which we know categorically where it ends, not only if you read the book that it's based on, but because there's been a show that engages with its ending, like, to what extent can that be spoiled? To what extent should we expect to be surprised? Like, for me, I know where it ends, and so I'm not necessarily interested in the rug being pulled out for me as much as I am like, what can the show? We have a start point and an end point. What can the show do in the meantime? I think it's interesting to think about in when we think about spoiler culture in 2022. Like, what does it? Same with Rings of Power. To be honest,
I was about to say that. Yeah.
What does it? When you remove the stakes of spoilers in lots of ways, obviously on an episode by episode case, that's not true. But
thanks for spoiling
the overarching.
Yeah. What does that? How does that affect the viewing experience?
I kind of feel like, even though we know how it's going to end, I feel like
along the way.
But I feel like there is still a lot of no more uncle fucking, please. Oh well, we already know what's gonna happen with that if you've read the book anyway.
That's a Hallmark card right there. Oh my god.
So uncomfortable.
I'll leave.
I think there's still a lot of scope for us to be surprised, and I feel like, even though we know how it's going to end, I feel like how we feel about that ending is very much shaped by what we see along the way. And so I hope is that it will be very satisfactory, and that we'll still enjoy her journey, and that there'll still be, a lot of wins for the character and a lot of movement and progress in her life, even though ultimately it does end with a very gory, bloody, ripping of your entrails kind of ending.
So that's all the biggest things we needed to talk about this week. But let us know what you thought about everything we raised. And thank you for watching. And do not forget to come back next week for our thoughts on House of the Dragon episode 5. Thank you very much. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.